The sonic landscape of 1966 was a world poised on the precipice of a radical transformation. Yet few could have predicted that the final blow to the conventions of popular music would be struck by four young men from Liverpool who, just years earlier, were synonymous with simple melodies and teenage hysteria. To understand why Tomorrow Never Knows is a masterpiece is to engage in a profound act of sonic archaeology, peeling back layers of myth, technology, and philosophy to reveal a cataclysmic shift in the human auditory experience. It is not merely the final track of the album Revolver. It is the definitive line in the sand where the Beatles ceased to be a mere pop group and became the avant-garde architects of a new reality. This piece of music represents the deliberate murder of the conventional 3-minute single and the subsequent resurrection of rock and roll as high art. Before Tomorrow Never Knows, the recording studio was a place to capture a performance. After it, the studio became a performance in itself, an instrument capable of manipulating time, space, and consciousness. The genius of this track lies in its rejection of almost every established rule of Western composition. By 1966, the musical world was still largely defined by diatonic harmony, predictable verse-chorus structures, and the inherent limitations of 4-track recording. Movement was considered the lifeblood of music, moving from the tonic to the dominant, creating tension and finding resolution. Tomorrow Never Knows spits on this tradition by embracing the drone, a single, relentless, and hypnotic C-chord foundation that never changes, never resolves, and never apologizes. This was the profound influence of Indian classical music, specifically the tambura drone that George Harrison had been immersing himself in. But here, it was applied with the raw aggression of a Western rhythm section. By utilizing a mixolydian mode, which features a flattened seventh, the track achieves a bluesy yet ancient resolve against the C major tonic, creating a state of suspended animation. It is static harmony weaponized, forcing the listener to stop listening for the next part and start listening to the now. In this vacuum of harmonic movement, interest must be generated through timbre, texture, and rhythmic intensity alone, a task that requires a level of creative bravery that remains staggering to this day. The inception of this masterpiece was fueled by John Lennon's pursuit of the unheard. Exhausted by the screaming mania of touring, where the band literally could not hear themselves play over the roar of the crowd, the Beatles retreated into Abbey Road with a singular, unspoken mission: to create sounds that had never existed in nature. Lennon did not walk into the studio wanting to write a catchy tune. Fueled by the psychedelic dissolution of his own ego via LSD and his reading of Timothy Leary's The Psychedelic Experience, itself an interpretation of the Tibetan Book of the Dead, he famously told producer George Martin that he wanted to sound like the Dalai Lama chanting from a mountaintop, surrounded by 4,000 monks. Most producers would have dismissed this as a drug-induced whim. But George Martin and the young, daring engineer Jeff Emerick understood that to capture the sound of the void, they had to break the machine. They were technicians of the impossible, and their willingness to violate the EMI rulebook was essential to the track's success. The drums on Tomorrow Never Knows represent a revolution in recording technique. Ringo's star, often unfairly marginalized in discussions of musical genius, provides what is perhaps the most heavy, sampled, and imitated breakbeat in history. This was not the swing of jazz or the straightforward beat of early rock. It was a proto-industrial loop played by a human being. To achieve this massive, dead, and thudding sound, Emerick did something sacrilegious. He heavily dampened the drum heads with woolen clothing and tea towels, And crucially, he moved the microphones right up to the skins. The EMI engineering manual explicitly forbade this practice, fearing that the high air pressure from the bass drum would damage the expensive ribbon microphones. Emerick ignored the rules, and the result was a rhythmic pulse that hits the listener in the chest rather than the ears. Ringo's pattern, a stuttering syncopated ostinato, refuses to settle, creating a rolling, tumbling sensation that drives the song forward like a tank through a dreamscape. Yet, the true avant-garde nature of Tomorrow Never Knows lies in its atmosphere. A swirling vortex of shrieking winds and unearthly cries that tear across the stereo field. These were not the products of synthesizers, which in 1966 were room-sized monstrosities inaccessible to the band. Instead, they were tape loops, a technique borrowed from the world of musique concrète and the works of Karlheinz Stockhausen. It was Paul McCartney, often mischaracterized as the safe balladeer of the group, who was diving deep into the London underground and experimenting with the idea that the recording medium itself could be manipulated. He realized that by removing the erase head from a tape recorder, sound would pile up on itself, saturating into a distorted, beautiful mess. Each member of the band went home and created random loops, a distorted guitar, a slowed-down laughing voice, an orchestral B-flat chord on a mellotron setting. They brought these loops into Studio 2, and what followed was a live performance of technology. They threaded these loops through multiple tape machines across different rooms in the Abbey Road complex, with engineers holding the tape taut with pencils to maintain tension. During the final mix, the mixing console was played like an instrument, with Martin and Emerick fading these chaotic sounds in and out in real time. The screaming seagull sound that pierces the mix is actually a distorted guitar loop, sped up and manipulated until it lost all resemblance to a stringed instrument. It is organized chaos, a randomness captured in amber that sounds different every time it is heard because the human brain struggles to find a repeatable pattern where none exists. Lennon's vocal performance further cements the track's status as a masterpiece of the otherworldly. To achieve the Dalai Lama effect, they ran his voice through a Leslie speaker cabinet, designed for Hammond organs. The Leslie contains a rotating drum and horn that physically spin at high speeds, throwing the sound in a 360-degree arc to create a warbling Doppler effect tremolo. Running a human voice through such a mechanical device was unheard of and required physical rewiring of the studio's equipment. The result is a voice that sounds as if it is emanating from inside the listener's own skull, vibrating with a mechanical flutter that mimics the very frequency of the nervous system. Lennon is not singing to an audience. He is communicating from a different dimension, a shaman of the electric age delivering a sermon for the end of the self. The lyrical content, stripped of any teenage romance, serves as a series of instructions for ego death. Turn off your mind, relax, and float downstream. This was a radical act of philosophical warfare in 1966, a year when the charts were still dominated by the sanitized pop of the Supremes or the Monkees. Lennon was demanding that the listeners stop consuming and start being, creating a cognitive dissonance between the ancient spiritual directive and the violently modern, mechanical backing track. The technical brilliance extends to the bass and guitar as well. Paul McCartney's bass stays anchored on a high C, providing a necessary tether for the surrounding chaos. But the tone is compressed to an extreme degree. By reducing the dynamic range, Emerick created a solid brick of sound that allowed the bass to cut through the dense fog of tape loops and crashing cymbals. It is a relentless pulse, the very heartbeat of the psychedelic trip. Then, there is the guitar solo, which famously violates the laws of physics. McCartney recorded a frantic, searing solo specifically for the track. But in the final mix, the tape was flipped. We hear the recording played backward, creating a unique audio envelope where the sound starts with the decay and ends with a sharp attack of the pick. This sucking, swelling effect is inherently disorienting because it violates our biological expectation of cause and effect. We hear the result of the action before the action itself. This was not a mere gimmick. It was a textural necessity that mirrored the song's theme of the void, a place where linear time and conventional logic cease to exist. Tomorrow Never Knows also pioneered the use of artificial double tracking, ADT, a technique invented by Ken Townsend at Abbey Road to allow the Beatles to thicken their vocals without having to sing the part twice. By using a second tape machine with a variable speed oscillator, they could create a slightly delayed copy of the vocal, making it sound massive and ethereal. This, along with vari-speed recording to alter the timbre of instruments, became the blueprint for everything that followed in the history of recorded music. Every time a modern producer uses a sample, every time an electronic artist manipulates a loop, and every time a heavy metal band utilizes the studio to create a wall of sound that could never be reproduced live, they are operating in the shadow of Tomorrow Never Knows. The legacy of this track is immeasurable because it was the moment the Beatles stopped being performers and became creators of a new language. They proved that music did not need to be pretty to be profound. It needed to be fearless. They abandoned the safety of the diatonic scale and the comfort of the love song to explore the terrifying and exhilarating potential of pure sound. The track is a dense, claustrophobic, and ultimately liberating wall of noise that demands the listener's absolute submission. It is a physical force, a vibration that alters consciousness and proves that music is more than entertainment. It is a tool for the exploration of the human condition. When the needle finally lifts from the groove of Tomorrow Never Knows, the world is not the same as it was before the music started. The ground has shifted, the air has liquefied. The Beatles walked into that studio as the world's most famous pop band and walked out as the high priests of a sonic revolution. If one can listen to this track and not feel the very foundations of their reality trembling, then they are not listening close enough. They are merely hearing, and in the world of Tomorrow Never Knows, there is a universe of difference between the two. This is the definitive masterpiece of the psychedelic era, a song that looked into the void and invited the rest of the world to follow, leaving behind the shores of the known and floating forever downstream into the infinite.